So we have a great panel here today to talk about the legislation, people that were actually involved in in all the critical stages of it. John Windhausen, who had worked at the FCC for 2.5 years, was senior counsel at the Senate Commerce Committee on the Democratic side, working for Chairman Fritz Hollings and Subcommittee Chairman Daniel Inouye. During the time leading up to and with the passage of the 1996 Act. After that, he went on to a number of positions, but later founded and led the Schools, Health, and Libraries Broadband Coalition from 2009 to just last year. And he's now consulting. Gina Keeney was John's counterpart on the Republican side. And from 1985 to 1994, she was the Republican chief counsel for communications on the Senate Commerce Committee, and John was involved in drafting on the Senate side the precursors to what became the 96 Act. Gina went on to become to the FCC towards the end of 1994 to be the first chief of the Wireless Bureau. But Gina is sort of the one person who could be on both panels on 1 and 2 today, because after the 1996 Act, she became chief of the Common Carrier Bureau and led the implementation of the 96 Act through its early critical stages. She then went on after that to head the FCC's International Bureau. So Gina really did quite the tour at the FCC in the leadership, and then went on to practice law until last year. Last but certainly not least of our panel is Katie King. So Katie succeeded Gina on the Republican side of the Senate Commerce Committee after the Senate flipped from Democratic control to Republican control at the start of 95. She had been a legislative assistant to Senator Pressler in 1993-94, and then became the communications counsel on the majority side of the Senate Commerce Committee, and saw the act through final passage. Katie had a major role in the high cost issues I will be talking about, and after she was did that, she went on to the FCC, where she continued to work on high cost issues and until she just retired last year. So we have the people here who were actually there, at least on the Senate side. Unfortunately, we don't have any House side people here today. But if you want to read at least one person's account of the 1996 Act, there's a good I think it's Substack set of articles by Colin Crowell telling the House Democratic, at least, perspective on the 1996 Act, which is not always the same as the Senate perspective. So with that, let's dive into the panel. And I guess I'd like to start with John and Gina a little bit, because the 96 Act was signed in February of 1996, but the work started earlier. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about when it started, and what groundwork had to be laid, and kind of what led to the key progress, and what were the key milestones, at least through the end of 94.
Do you want to start, John?
Okay, I'll start and then turn it to you. I'll lay a little bit of the foundation in the background. So, of course, the 1934 Act was really driven by two industries. It was an effort to regulate the broadcasters and an effort to regulate AT&T. And both of those industries actually welcomed that regulation, because they, at least at AT&T's part, they used the regulation as a way to keep out competitors. And so they were able to rationalize their monopoly status. Well, that all changed leading into the 1996 Act. It started with the wheels were in motion with the MFJ, the court decision that broke up AT&T. As the beginnings of competition came into the long distance market, and then we began to see benefits from long distance industry competition. And we collectively decided, we really ought to have a more competitive environment for all of these industries. And that's what really led to the idea behind the Telecom Act. Gina and I worked very closely together on the Cable Act in 92 and the Spectrum Auction Act in 93. So we had a good working bipartisan relationship right from the beginning. And we put that bill together for Senator Hollings, Danforth, and Inouye in 1993, S 1822, that passed the Senate Commerce Committee by a vote of 18-2. And that included the E-rate provision, the Snow-Rockefeller Amendment, which was maybe the one partisan blip where that was adopted by a 10-8 vote in the Senate Commerce Committee. But then it became more bipartisan as the process rolled along. And, we made a lot of progress in 1993, 94. Senator Dole then raised some objections, so we weren't able to get it done in that Congress. And then when the elections took place, Republicans took over control of both the House and the Senate. And the big question was, well, what's going to happen with Telecom Act reform? Well, the reality is we picked up right where we had left off from the year before and worked closely with Katie King and Senator Pressler to craft a new version, a revised version, but still building off of the work that we had done in the 2 years before that, ultimately leading to the signing of the bill on February 8th of 1996. So, Gina, I'll toss it to you to see if I got that right.
Okay, of course you did. I guess I would add to that, and maybe this is a lesson learned from the process and a little bit of hope, that despite having very different perspectives and very different personalities, the members and the staff all wanted to do something. And I think they had developed over, even in the late 80s, kind of both the muscle and momentum for doing things. We had passed authorization bills that hadn't been passed for years for FCC, NTIA, Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Some of you may remember. And smaller bills, too, that may be of historical interest, but we adjusted the terms of the FCC commissioners. So they had developed the ability and kind of the momentum to pick up the lighter weights, and then we're ready to pick up the heavier weights for the 93 Act, which was just Danforth and Inouye, and a very slim bill. Didn't get very far, but helped set up sort of the framework for the 94 Act. And one of the themes of the 94 Act was, 1934 to 1994. And we were sure we were going to have that 60-year anniversary and revision. It didn't quite turn out that way, but the work was being done early on. And mostly because there was a will to work together.
Maybe toss it to Katie to pick up from the change in control in 95 and kind of what were the drivers from your perspective, or what were the key things that happened in your perspective from 95 to 96?
Well, I think it was actually a pretty smooth transition as far as, what the work that had gone before, and we were just building on it. Senator Pressler was, very focused on getting legislation passed. I think he hand carried a draft bill to all the members of the committee and, worked, really well with, my picture just disappeared. How bizarre. Anyway,
We can see you, Katie.
well, I can't see anyone. Okay. You're all back. Anyway, I mean, I think we all worked, really well together on the Senate side. I think our main adversaries were the House side on universal service issues, but on the Senate side, we got along fine. John, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in to add to that, Katie. Do you remember that in January of 1995, right after you had assumed the majority, you and the other Republicans put together your own draft bill. And then we on the Democratic side put together our draft bill 2 weeks later in February. And then we had a mini conference of our own just among the senators, the Senate Republicans and Democrats. We got together and worked out a joint bill that ended up becoming S652 and passing through the Senate. So yes, once we had that sort of dueling bills at the start, then we collaborated and worked together, and we were all bought in to continue that collaborative work and get the bill through.
I mean, in some ways, what you're saying is remarkable, given that the time going on at the same time was the Gingrich revolution in the House, right? With a complete upheaval and overturning of all sorts of things in the House. Yeah, much more continuity, it sounds like, in the Senate.
Yeah.
So what?
It was.
Go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I was just agreeing with you.
Yeah.
And I'll just add to that, John, that on the Senate passage, the joint bill that Katie and I worked on, S652, had passed the Senate by a vote of 81 to 18. So it was really quite an overwhelming support of votes for the bill.
And I would add to that, too, is some of it has to do with the makeup of the Commerce Committee jurisdiction, because the members, might have one particular interest on telecom, but a very different interest in fisheries or airport slots. And you had to be willing to put it bluntly, you can't be a jerk, because you're not going to get what you want on all these other issues. So you had to kind of find a way to find agreement, even if you had different interests on telecom.
So so it sounds like, and one question I had was like, so how did members' relationships play into the development and passage? And Gina, I think you were just sort of talking a little bit about that.
I think there was a feeling. I know my boss, Senator Danforth, would say, I don't understand why people want to get elected if they don't want to do anything. And there was, this constant push with staff. Don't be sitting around here. Get some bills passed.
Maybe kind of can you help people understand sort of what the key drivers were on the legislation? I mean, usually there's like an engine and there's lots of cars that get added to the train along the way, but sort of what were the key drivers here that really pushed the legislation along?
Well, I'll take a stab at starting that off, but I think the first driver was the desire by the Bell operating companies to be released from the restrictions that came out of the MFJ. I mean, the breakup of AT&T separated the long distance industry from the 7 local Bell operating companies, but the Bell companies were still, in the court's view, the Bell companies were still considered monopolies over local phone service, so they were barred from providing long distance service, information services, or manufacturing. And the theory was by the court that because they had a monopoly over local, they could use that monopoly to extend and have market power in these other adjacent markets. So the Bell companies were very actively engaged in trying to overturn those restrictions. And I think this is one of those bipartisan issues where both Democrats and Republicans were really dedicated to the idea that a single federal court judge should not be setting telecom policy, that's really should be an act of Congress. So that was probably the first big driver of the Telecom Act by the Bell companies. But then there was also a desire to promote competition. And, the cable industry could not provide telephone service. The telephone companies could not provide cable service, which is hard to think of that was the universe that we were in back then. But both of those industries also supported being free to enter each other's markets. And then you had the universal service provisions, which I think both Gina and Katie mentioned, which were bedrock foundational principles. If you're going to open the market to competition, well, you needed to make sure that there was a subsidy mechanism in place to continue to reach these rural and high-cost areas, and then the schools and libraries and healthcare providers as well. So I actually put a blog together, an article that the Benton Institute was gracious to publish, and I identified the 5 different themes of the Telecom Act. So the first ones I already mentioned: first, opening the markets to competition; second, phasing in deregulation, not immediate deregulation, but phasing it in; third, universal service; fourth, there were consumer safeguards; and then fifth was the encouragement of online services. So I think those 5 different components were really driving and created momentum. Once folks saw the bill moving, then others wanted to get on that train as well.
Were there industry groups that wanted to block the legislation? Or would have had incentives to block the legislation?
I think I think every industry had something they wanted. So I think I don't know that there was anyone trying to block it, but correct me if I'm wrong, Gina.
No, I agree with that. And I think, there's a moving train, and a majority of the Commerce Committee is for it or has co-sponsored it. Stopping it would be pretty hard. So you might as well just hop on the train, I think was what was going on. And it was more an argument about the timing and the terms. The Bell companies wanted freedoms. What were the preconditions to getting those?
Just looking at the final vote on the conference report, it was pretty overwhelming. I mean, the Senate voted in favor of the final language by a vote of 91-5. And the House was similar, 414-16 against. So that gives you an indication that there was a huge amount of support. We must have done something right in the conference report to work out the issues, that as the longer things went along in a bipartisan way, the more votes we were able to get to support the bill.
Just one other question on that line. It seems like looking back in retrospect, if it were AT&T or MCI, they ended up losing strategically a lot of position as a result of the 96 Act. Do you have any speculation as to why they didn't just move to block, since the Bells weren't needed legislation to get into long distance?
I think John referred to this, but there was a sense that Congress needed to act. You need to have what the judge had blessed as the law of the land. And there was also kind of I don't know if it was misguided or correctly guided, a sense of competitiveness. The U.S. was being held back by holding back some of our largest companies in the telecommunications industry. And I don't think AT&T or Sprint or others at the time really had a great answer to that. Why would you keep, turns out they may not have been interested, but why would you keep the Bell companies out of manufacturing? How does that help the country?
Yeah, I remember us talking about everybody wanting to get into everybody else's business. And that was sort of a goal, to open all markets to competition.
So what did it take most legislation is a coalition, right? So what did it take to pull the coalition together here?
Well, I think it started small, as John and Katie have talked about, which is, the Bell companies really pushing, and then others saying, well, the cable companies weren't all that happy with the cable legislation and thought maybe they should get something more out of this one. Much later in the process, the broadcasters said, oh, hey, we've got stuff we want too. So it kept building because there was momentum to do something.
Yeah, I think everybody wanted something. Every part of the industry wanted something. And so that was enough momentum to...
Well, that's true. I think I just add, but they also had to give something up in return for getting something. So the Bells, just to take that example, right?
Good point.
We allowed them into long distance manufacturing and information services, which they really wanted, but that also meant they had to give up their local monopoly. And that was the critical importance of the unbundling provisions that required the local phone companies and the bell companies to open up their networks for interconnection and use by potential competitors, and created the CLEC, the Competitive Local Exchange Carriers. So the bells, were getting things and losing things. Same with the cable companies who were getting some rate deregulation that benefited them. They were getting the right to get into the local market, but then they had to give up some other things like on pole attachments. So it was always a game of trying to match that. Nobody got everything that they wanted, but it also had to fit within the structure of the purpose of the Telecom Act to reduce barriers to entry and allow more parties to enter each other's markets.
Right.
So out of curiosity, now we look at the telecom markets, and wireless is this huge player. But if we think back to 94, 95, I mean, we barely had the broadband spectrum auctions, I think, Gina, that authorized. I guess maybe, no, I guess you were still there. And you ran, right? You ran. And then, so, and if I remember right, the first digital cell phones came out in like 95 or something like that, right? So it's like really early. Well, what was wireless in this? Were people thinking about wireless at all in this picture?
It's funny. I ran across a memo to my boss talking about the interests of another senator. I won't get into too much detail, but the cell phone companies were not entirely happy with the 92 Act, and they wanted certain protections. And they also didn't want to have to contribute to any universal service. So they were hoping to get more freedoms and not have to contribute. And that is obviously not what happened. But they were players in that sense, that they had things they wanted, but they didn't get very far with what they were asking for.
John, Katie, any thoughts to add on sort of how you were thinking about wireless at the time, if you can put your head back 30 years?
Well, I think we had addressed some of the wireless issues a couple of years earlier in the Spectrum Auction Act, which also required the Department of Defense to give up some of their spectrum. I think it was 200 megahertz at the time that we wanted to make available for PCS, personal communication services. So that was an initial foray into trying to free up more spectrum, which the wireless companies had already obtained a couple years before. So I think they also liked the pole attachments provision that would make it a little easier for them to locate their antennas. But I don't recall, other than that, where the wireless industry had as much at stake in the 96 Act.
So let's turn to one of the other things that was you mentioned earlier as a key part of the 96 Act, which was universal service, and sort of what were the dynamics around that in the Senate and in between the Senate and the House. I mean, I'll share my perspective when I was doing the implementation at the FCC is that the Senate had its view of universal service and the House had its view of universal service, and they weren't really the same.
Fair.
So I guess maybe talk a little about the universal service provisions and the farm team, and how did that all come together, and what role did that play in the actual act itself?
Well, I'll start with a couple observations. That universal service was not even written into the 1934 Act, not in so many words. And when there were monopolies, and monopolies were presumed, there was no need to worry quite as much about universal service. But on the other hand, with competition, and if others were going to be allowed into the local telephone, what was considered the local telephone market at the time, you had to come up with some way to address, you can call it was called all different kinds of things: cream skimming, cherry picking, carrier of last resort, left holding the bag. And so that was a driver. How are you going to address universal service in the face of competition? But Katie and John were very involved in the details of all that.
Well,
Katie?
I mean, well, you have all of these big square states that have a lot of rural areas that, you know, senators were concerned that they would be left behind with, you know, all the new technologies and things. So, you know, our biggest opponents on universal service were with the House. Remember fighting with our House colleagues in conference because they really didn't like the universal service provisions. And, you know, and that's because a lot of House members didn't represent rural areas.
Well, John, you mentioned the farm team, and just to clarify, so that was sort of a subgroup of the Senate Commerce Committee members. I remember Senator Exon, the Democrat from Nebraska, and then Ted Stevens and Earl Comstock were driving a lot of the farm team work. So it was a bipartisan group subset. And Senator Hollings, my boss, also had a lot of rural telcos in South Carolina. So we were supportive of the farm team's efforts. But that was, again, a bipartisan effort to try to ensure that the Telecom Act didn't mean that the rural and high-cost areas were going to be left to their own devices. There need to be a more explicit mechanism to make sure that that funding would continue. So I remember working very closely with the rural telcos on those universal service provisions and the farm team to get that done. And then I think the House ended up in the conference, even though the House staff, and as Katie said, weren't all that comfortable with the universal service provisions. At the end of the day, they ceded to the Senate because they realized if there wasn't a universal service protections, there was not going to be a bill, that they had that much support in the Senate that it would die. So they needed to get along with the Senate, which they ended up doing.
I remember being in a meeting with the farm team staff and Senator Rockefeller, and he said at one point, "What am I doing on the farm team?" Which cracked us up. But of course, the Snow Rockefeller provisions were an important part of the universal service provisions too. So.
Well, interestingly, I mean, John mentioned earlier, and the fact that I had not realized, which is that the Snow Rockefeller provisions, or at least their predecessors, had actually been in the 93, 94 legislation.
94
legislation.
And we had even been meeting with House staff back then on, you know, how, if they were to pass, if both houses were to pass a bill, how would the final bill end up? And there was very different take on E-rate and universal service, even back then in the House, and E-rate in particular, which surprised me a little bit. But I do remember doing a little behind the scenes lobbying of groups to try to move them.
And obviously, yeah, Ed Markey, obviously in the House, was a big champion of E-rate. But I mean, it sort of seems like that was a big shift in. I mean, universal service up to that point had been mostly high cost and low income after the kind of access charge changes in the 1980s, right, with the introduction of Lifeline. But that was a real shift to institutional anchor. What we might now think of, John maybe came up with the term of anchor tenants.
Anchor institutions. Right.
Yeah.
But yeah, on the...
So was that... No, go ahead, John.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to note that Senator McCain tried to strip the E-rate provisions and rural healthcare provisions on the Senate floor, and he offered an amendment to delete those provisions out of the universal service package, and his motion lost by a pretty overwhelming vote of something like 58 to 34. So again, a lot of Republicans as well as Democrats supported the E-rate program when it got to the floor.
So turning to get to another area that was sort of nascent at the time, and just trying to keep my eye on the clock here too. broadband. John, I saw you spoke at Benton earlier this year, or early a couple months ago, I guess, on one of the other 96 Act commemorations, and saw that you had sort of said, "Gee, you wished you had addressed the classification of broadband at the time." And I went back and looked, and I thought you were being a little hard on yourself, but given that cable modems really didn't start until 1996 commercially. But kind of the Act did talk about advanced telecommunication services. So where was kind of what we now think of as broadband in the consciousness of the Congress and in the contemplation of the bill?
Well, we really didn't know enough about the future. We were, I think, somewhat prescient in identifying advanced services as a key component, and then built into the universal service provision some flexibility for advanced services we recognize the market would evolve. And so we didn't want universal service to be stuck at one baseline technology. So we needed to encourage advanced services and for the FCC to have the freedom to add services like broadband into the Universal Service Fund in the future. So in that sort of big picture way, I think we got it right. What we got it wrong was really from a legal perspective, we didn't clarify the definition of broadband, whether it's going to be a telecom common carrier service or a information service. And I think, I came out of the FCC where FCC had been struggling with this question through the computer inquiry line of decisions, computer 1, computer 2, then computer 3. And I sort of accepted, okay, well, let's use those FCC definitions to put those into legislation to identify the difference between common carriage and Title I information services. But the difficulty we had is that we were also trying to reform the MFJ language, which used this the FCC language was based on enhanced services. The MFJ talked about information services. So we were trying to wrestle with definitions that would clarify, but we didn't really do a good enough job. And if you look at the language in the Act, they really are overlapping. And yet the Act also said you have to be one or the other. You can't be both. So we created this confusion that ended up playing over decades of litigation over net neutrality. And that was a real failure on our part. We didn't clarify that. And maybe if we'd had another year or two to get that done, it would have been more clear what the boundaries are. But at that stage, we had the momentum, so we needed to get the bill done when we did.
Well, John, in your defense, sometimes in legislation, if things are clear, you can't get them passed either.
That's a fair point. All parties sort of read the definitions the way they wanted to. Right.
Well, I remember being at the FCC after the Act passed, and Earl Comstock absolutely pounding the table and insisting that the internet was a common carrier service, a telecom service.
And that was the legislative intent.
And that was, yes, as the absolutely crystal clear legislative intent, and according to Earl. So that was definitely an interesting period.
Or just to clarify, Earl was working for a Republican senator at the time, right, who was calling for that regulation.
Yes.
Yeah, for people who don't know, Earl Comstock was the counsel to Senator Stevens from Alaska. So, but he teamed up on that with later on, at least at the time, and maybe later on, with Senator Burns from Montana on the same issue. So. One other provision that has sort of continued to be in discussion is Section 230, which is sort of out there in Title V of the Act. And I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit on how Section 230 came to be, what its main drivers were at the time. Remember, it was called the Communications Decency Act, at least at one point. So
I remember, and I don't remember which industry group this was, but I remember being threatened by them that said, if we don't get Section 230, we're going to work to kill the bill. Which, it was very important to them. So I don't know if I don't know if anyone else had similar conversations, but as I said, I don't remember who it was. So
I remember in the Senate, we had the Communications Decency Act, sponsored by Senator Exon, largely from Nebraska. And I believe Section 230 originated on the House side and was an effort by the online industry to say, look, if you want to encourage these advanced services, we need to have some protections. We shouldn't be liable for third parties posting material on our websites. And if we're, everybody's so in favor of these new information services, but a certain number of lawsuits could cut off the flow of investment into the online services community, and it could be could be the death of the industry right from even before it got started. Now, Section 230 has turned into much more controversial today. Now that the online services, which was a good thing. I mean, we wanted to encourage these online services. That was what these advanced services were all about. So we were very sympathetic, even on the Senate side, to incorporating that House provision into the final bill. But now, of course, it's taken on a life of its own. And really, there's a good argument why we need to revisit that blanket Section 230 exception, because, these services and AI pose some fundamental threats to our economy and to jobs and to decency. So there's a real need to take another look at the AI industry.
Gina, Katie, any thoughts further on?
No, just to add maybe a humorous note, which is an early version of the Decency Act was broader. And I remember walking to the Senate floor with my boss, Senator Danforth, and raising constitutional issue. Was this unconstitutional? And he looked at me like, are you out of your mind? And then it passed 96-4 or something. So, don't bother me with the details on that.
And then some parts were declared unconstitutional, if I recall. So you weren't wrong.
Yeah, but we weren't at the Supreme Court. We were in a political body.
Very interesting question, though. Guy came in. It was sort of with everyone wanting to do something. What kept us from collapsing of its own weight or becoming, like the Christmas tree that just can't move at some point.
Well, I think there was just a real desire to get things done among the members, but the industry as well, and an inability to sort of stop the moving train, unless you were going to mess around with the rural telecoms. They might have stopped it.
Yeah, I think there was really something for just about every industry in the bill. There was something everybody wanted, one way or the other. I mean, they didn't get everything they wanted, but there was, as I recall, there was just something.
Well, I would say that's all true, but I would also point out that there were several public interest provisions also included in the bill, like a privacy provision, disabilities access, the V-chip allowing consumers to screen out violent programming. We included a provision to bar redlining of service to low-income communities, and there was an anti-slamming provision to make sure long-distance companies didn't charge you excessively. So there were a number of, I know Ralph Nader criticized the act as corporate welfare. But it wasn't just the industries who were asking for this. We had a lot of public interest support and consumer support as well.
Right.
Maybe I was wondering if you all could think about, do you see a constellation of issues now that could drive further compromise? Or are we in such a adversarial environment that is not possible? I mean, but you had some magic in 1993 to 96, right? So are there ingredients for more magic?
Well, I hope there's a growing recognition that universal service is sort of becoming unsustainable. Not the concept of universal service, but the exact mechanism, and that needs to be revised. And, if members as different as the members were back in the 93, 96 era can get together to find common interest, I want to hold out some hope that it can be done today. These aren't necessarily partisan issues. They're more geographic issues. And it seems to me there is some hope that universal service could be addressed by legislation.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a matter of putting a package together of corresponding interests. And as we said earlier, you some parties get something but have to give something up. That's kind of the framework that we use to try to get the 96 Act passed. And I could see a scenario where that could happen in the future as well. Universal service funds, the funding mechanism does need to be fixed because it's not sustainable the way it is right now. And that, could lead to some greater contribution from the online services platform companies. And the reason that you think of them is they're getting enormous benefits out of deploying broadband to every consumer. I mean, that expands their market base if everybody has an internet connection. So that's sort of one idea of a compromise. I'm not saying I'm fixated on that, but there are, if we can think of ways to put our priorities together in a way that is a balanced bill, I think that could be successful. I also want to pick up, Gina, you said something off camera, which I thought was so apt after the Benton Institute event, where you said, people can disagree with each other, but that doesn't make you evil, right?
Yeah.
So if we can have a mentality of let's have a debate around the issues and pros and cons, and the ultimate irony here is that usually a bipartisan solution is not just political, but that's often the best policy. Because it's oftentimes when you get extremes from either party trying to go off on a philosophical tangent, that can just make it very difficult or impossible to get things done. And it's also often you need that countervailing force from the other side, from the other party, to try to engage in a more balanced policy result as well as political result.
So I guess I sort of looking backwards, I guess at this point, maybe one of the final question for me to ask all of you is kind of what do you see as sort of being key lessons from the 96 Act effort, the multi-year 1996 Act effort, and what are the good stories that we've missed here, and the good issues, good things that we didn't talk about today?
Mm.
That would be informative to people.
Well, I think maybe the Rolling Stones said it best. You find sometimes you might get what you want. You can't get all of it. You can't always get what you want, but you just might get what you need. If people could approach legislation that way, that you're not going to win everything. You can sometimes get what you need.
Well, I guess I'll just add, I see the structure here that we've talked about a few times of, the balance, the need for cooperation, collaboration from both sides of the aisle. Having said that, we don't have the issues yet around AI we don't understand AI well enough yet to legislate at a federal level. I think there's a need for some controls and protections going forward. But what those are yet, how you define the problem, is still a bit open-ended. So my thought is that we really need an independent commission, not an FCC commission, but an independent commission to provide us a report to Congress and to policymakers about what the approach should be with regard to AI and the future of universal service. I see those as linked together because we haven't solved the universal service problem yet, but I think AI and the future of technologies and satellite and fixed wireless, as well as fiber, all have a role to play. So I think we need to have some independent report that would clarify the issues, and that would give us a starting point for a bipartisan piece of legislation going forward.
Katie, one thing just popped in my head, and it's because I think it plays into the next panel some. But the 1996 Act set really pretty stringent deadlines for action at the FCC, which Gina, I know you and I both, and some of the people in the next panel had to live through. But what was the thought process behind that in Congress? What was the impetus for it in terms of why have them be short? What was going on in the minds of all of you as you were working on those things?
Well, I didn't set the deadlines, John and Katie.
Yeah, you had a little.
Although I do think they were a blessing in disguise. You had to get stuff done. You couldn't just debate forever. But what was in your minds?
Well, the Bell companies were pushing for a date certain for them to be allowed into these new lines of business. And they were really pushing as fast as they could and to try to get these provisions over the finish line so they could enter these new markets. They really viewed it as essential to their survival. So we didn't give them a date certain because we thought, well, what if competition doesn't develop? We don't want to deregulate you until there's actual competition on the ground, if you will. So because we didn't give them a fixed date, we expedited the rulemaking proceedings to have the FCC move more quickly. So I think we gave 6 months for local competition, and then universal service had a joint board. So I think that was 18 months or something like that. So I know it was a really hard work by the FCC. It was ridiculous that we gave them such a short time frame. Apologies for that for that, Gina.
It turned out okay.
It turned out okay. You did a great job.
Well, the next panel can take credit. Deserves credit.
So maybe another question that came out. So kind of looking back now with the benefit of 30 years of hindsight and technology develops and everything else, what in your mind came out differently than you anticipated?
Well, I guess in my mind, we would have had broadband universally available to everybody by now. And we don't have that. We still have 10 to 15% of consumers around the country who don't have access to broadband, and that's a problem. Now it's hard. I'm not saying it's an easy problem, and the BEAD program and the Capital Projects Fund are going to be making progress toward solving that problem. But we see the BEAD program unfortunately being delayed for political agendas that on both sides that have made that program not as successful as I've wanted it to be. So that's frustrating. And ideally, the Universal Service Fund would have provided enough funding, but there hasn't been enough oversight over the recipients of that Universal Service Fund support to make sure that it's actually being spent to accomplish those objectives. So there's been a lot of money spent, not as much oversight as I would have liked to have seen. But I think that's something we are close to solving, and I hope we can solve it in the next 4 years, meaning get everybody access by the year 2030. And so that work still needs to be done.
Katie and Gina, any thoughts on what came out differently?
I think local competition took longer than we might have hoped at the time. It came from places we didn't necessarily anticipate. I don't know how many people under the age of 30 even think of a wireline phone and having one installed. So I think there's local competition developed that way. I think another thing that didn't turn out, or maybe it wasn't as measurable as we would have liked, it is the E-rate. That literacy rates and math knowledge have dropped dramatically. I don't think it's because of the E-rate. I think it's in spite of. But maybe we had hoped there'd be more measurable benefits.
Katie, any final thoughts? It's interesting what you say, Gina, because GAO was always after the commission, and probably still is, about not having performance measures tied to educational outcomes for the E-rate program. But
you're asking the FCC, to opine on something that's not their expertise too. So,
which is why they never happened.
Right.
All right, I think we've come to time. So I hope everybody will join me in thanking our wonderful panelists who really lived through all the legislative process. So
Thank you.
Thanks.